with you. This is a reading from the Good News according to Matthew. This gospel, as I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, is that moment when Jesus is challenged about his loyalty to the state, I guess, and whether he should respond positively to Caesar or not. Anyway, let me read it. When the chief priests and the Pharisees had heard the parables, they realized that Jesus was speaking about them. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap Jesus in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you're sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth and show deference to no one. For you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise you, Jesus Christ. Let me start this morning with a little Jewish story. The Jews have the best stories, I think, next to the Irish. Who's the best? I'm not sure, but this is a Jewish story of a man who was not Jewish, he was a Gentile, who went to one of the great rabbis, Rabbi Shammai, and he said, "Convert me to Judaism on one condition, that you can teach me the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot." Very clever, very clever. Well, Shammai threw him out of the synagogue and said, "Get out of here. I'm not going to accept your conditions." So he went to another wise rabbi, Rabbi Hillel, and repeated his request. "Convert me to Judaism, but on one condition, that you can teach the whole Torah while I am standing on one foot." Rabbi Hillel converted him with these words, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbour. This is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary." And so our Gentile became a Jew. Good little story, sir. I was going to do it in one foot, but my balance is gone now. I didn't want to disappear under the pulpit. 2 weeks ago, Pope Francis, October the 3rd, that's about 2 weeks ago, so he went to Assisi, to the town of his namesake, Francis of Assisi, and he posted us a letter. Very clever little symbol. The letter is called Fratelli Tutti, or as one of my little friends said, Tutti Frutti. Fratelli Tutti. It means fraternity for all, in my rough translation of the Italian. He's talking about fraternity, a very male word, I must admit, but it's the word of Francis of Assisi himself. And as is his wont, the Pope likes to name he's named a couple of his letters from phrases that Francis of Assisi used himself. The last one was Laudato Si, wonderful letter about the environment that he wrote 5 years ago, 2015. Well, this letter, a couple of weeks ago, is called Fratelli Tutti. And here I am, 1 foot, I'm going to tell you what the letter's about. The letter says, wake up to yourself. Our politics need to be marked by fraternity and respect. The future of our human race may be at stake. The Pope uses the word politics or political 100 times in this letter. And he's saying our politics at the moment are so fraught and we are so divided by many things that he would suggest the future of the human race is at stake. Pretty serious words, but well, I don't think there's been many of us who would argue against it. This particular letter, let me list a few things that he talks about. He talks a great deal about human rights, the human rights of people, particularly those who are most vulnerable. There's a phrase, I think it was a favourite phrase of that former Governor General of ours, William Dean. Bill Dean was a wonderful leader. And he used to say the measure of our Australian society will be calculated on how we treat our most vulnerable. The measure of who we are, the level of who we are, the index is how do we treat the most vulnerable. And this letter is full of that principle. So he talks about the vulnerable of society, women and children, of racial minorities, of refugees, of the aged, and all sorts of other vulnerable people. Now, none of that's new. That's the sort of stuff that you get from pulpits for years, I guess. We talk about generalisations and, looking after the marginalised. We think of the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek. We've got it there, but we live in a very toxic culture which sees things in different terms. It sees things often in economic terms. Don't want to damage the market, don't want to sort of, get things upset. And we've got to be reasonable about how we balance looking after the vulnerable with the economic health of our country. Okay, that's an economic issue. But anyway, Francis doesn't back off that at all. In this letter, he's being, I guess you've read, but his pontificate, his time as Pope, has been marked by extraordinary frankness and concrete matters that he enters into. There's a lot of criticism about him. That people are saying he's going too far, he's becoming too political. He's being too exact. In this particular letter, he will criticise neoliberalism. That's an economic term, isn't it? That's described a new sense of, how can I sum it up? But it's a new sense of those 19th century principles we had that profits were huge and sort of ungoverned in the way that people sought after. He attacks populism. Populism is this sense that of moving away from any sort of elite commentary in our community. He says populism is right, but when populism is in the hands of dictators, which has often been commented about in the world today, then this is a very, very dangerous mix. He talks about the cult of individualism. Think about your selfies and your phones and that sense of the world is surrounding my particular needs. So he doesn't back off and get lost in generalisations at all. Fratelli Tutti. It's a letter that, of course, I'm recommending to you. What are the questions he's talking about, particularly this question of individualism? He asked the question, how do we become a we, W-E? How do we break out of our individualism and become concerned with our community? By the way, I think that's what draws us to this little church of St Joseph's, by the way. I think our sense of care for one another, our sense of community, our sense of being a group of people trying to make sense of their life, I think that's really part of the motivation of who we are. But he asked the question, how do we do that as a community? How do we become universal? Now, by that he means nationalism, you know, our country better or worse, is really one of the great problems that we're facing in this planet. You know, we will protect our borders. We need to protect ourselves. Our prime concern is for being Australian. Well, there's some truth in that. But there's a very big heresy in it too. Because the we is this human race of ours which is facing questions that it has never faced before in my lifetime, I must say. So he says, how do we break out of this sense of nationalism? By the way, I'm making a real exception today of the Wallabies playing New Zealand this afternoon, right? That's serious male matter. You may not understand it. But how do we become less than just our own little group or our own little tribe? He puts the question in the same way. He says, how do we become more Catholic? The word Catholic means universal. It means exempting nobody. It means reaching out to every culture. The word Catholic, Katholikos in Greek, means to be universal. And he's appealing to that better angel in all of us. Not simply because it's a good idea, but he's saying perhaps the future of the human race depends upon us breaking out of those narrow issues. In the letter, by the way, quite unusually, pretty unusual for papal letters actually, he quotes the Egyptian imam, Ahmed Tayeb. He quotes an Islamic leader and draws upon his wisdom on the same issue. He quotes a Hindu hero, Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi. He quotes Martin Luther King, a Baptist minister. So in a sense, in doing that, he's really trying to reflect and bring together the fact that people of common values, common ideas, might come together. Fratelli tutti. The fraternity, the solidarity that we need to adopt. Pretty general stuff, I know, but I can't help thinking that there are so many habits in my life of individualism, of nationalism, of narrowness of mind, that I think this letter is addressing. Now we come to the gospel. The gospel is saying, it's a wonderful little part of the gospel that I can remember learning about when I was a little tacker. And I think the teacher was saying, look how clever Jesus is. His critics come up and say, you're going to pay tax to Caesar? Well, you know, when you get to tax, you're getting into real stuff, aren't you? And if he says yes, he'll betray his country, his tribe, these people who are suffering under the colonial grip of Rome. If he says no, they'll report him to Caesar, or the police, the soldiers, Pilate. So it's a real dilemma. And he comes out with it, as this teacher of mine would say, he takes a coin and he says, who's the image? He says, well, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's. And I can remember saying, wow, What an answer. Why, how clever. Well, now, in my dotage, I'm wondering what that distinction means. Is the Pope talking about matters of God or matters of Caesar? Is the Pope becoming too political? His critics would say, get back into the sacristy. Look, you've got to talk about prayer, sacraments, going to confession, blah, 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 blah. Keep out of this political stuff. Well, Francis won't do that. 5 years ago, he said, our planet is facing the most incredible future if we don't attend to ourselves and begin to understand the sacredness of this planet. You see, the point he was making is that everything is sacred. And let's be careful of the interpretation of Jesus' response. Everything is sacred in Palestine. Even taxation. Even the colonial sort of grip that Rome had. They're matters that are not, I believe, and I certainly believe now, that are excluded from our concern of preaching the gospel. So don't be seduced to think religious thinking and our church should simply occupy itself with the sacristy, with matters that seem religious, because behind those issues which seem religious are sometimes really serious political issues. Now, I can't, of course, I don't want to develop the practicalities of that, but simply to alert ourselves to that sort of thinking that is useful. So that's the letter which that has been presented to us by our Pope, Fratelli Tutti. And if we ignore the real issues of our day and the political issues of our day, we're being untrue to the very thing for which Jesus lived and died. And it's calling on all of us to be perhaps more thoughtful, more concerned about the wider community and its dynamics than perhaps we have ever been before. Fraternity among all, solidarity among all. Our concern for our future depends upon our concern for the most vulnerable people in our society. That's the trigger that sort of opens us to a wider sense of who we are.